Welcome back to SMNI. This is Business and Politics. We're talking to Professor Renato de Castro of Salle University. Sir, I said that I wanted to ask you about two professors, besides Graham Allison. The other one, I'm not sure you're familiar with Jeffrey Sachs, whose work is really more focused on poverty alleviation. But he's been sort of the alternate view, offering the alternate view in the U.S. about China. And his point was that the Americans should not be afraid of China because all the Chinese want really are the same things that Americans want. That they only want their own share of the pie, so to speak. What do you think? Would you agree with his reading of the Chinese based on what you know?
Yes, I will agree with him.
Okay.
Starting from the assumption that the Chinese are just like, the Americans of what they want. Because let's go back to why did the United States became first a regional power and of course eventually a superpower. Yeah. So it started of course with the Monroe Doctrine, and later of course 100 years later, by the time of President Theodore Roosevelt, you have the Roosevelt corollary. Yeah. This means driving away the European powers from the Western Hemisphere. The United States became a global power because it became the leading or hegemonic power in the Western Hemisphere by refusing to allow any external power. That is the same thing that China wants. China wants also to become a power here in the region, and by becoming the dominant power here, it means driving away the United States. Basically preventing the United States Navy from, of course, conducting its offshore strategic balancing to the region. So I will agree with him.
That's interesting. Foreign policy, and I'm not an expert in any way at all, but it seems to me, and I'm more familiar with economic theory. I don't know if you've heard of Thorstein Veblen, and his theory was basically that, unlike what Marx was saying, that there's no really class struggle, that the underprivileged class really want to be the upper class. And so in a sense, what you were saying is that in saying that the Chinese want what the Americans want, they don't want to really fight the Americans. They want to be the new Americans.
They want to drive away the Americans from this region because they want to play the role that the United States is playing right now in the Western Hemisphere. Based on the Monroe Doctrine and of course the Roosevelt corollary. There's only one dominant power here in the Western Hemisphere. China would also want to have that, that status, the only dominant power in the region. And this is captured by the grand strategy of the President Xi Jinping, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which basically means Asians should resolve Asian problems alone.
Well, now that brings me to my point, because I think the first time we met, I asked you about the pronouncements of President Marcos, and I wanted to hear about your take on his foreign policy. Given all of these dynamics, what then now is the prudent course, for the Philippines? How do we move forward?
Of course, I will talk about in terms of the design. The president, of course, is the architect of Philippine foreign policy. This is the design, but what is the reality? Of course, he is very clear-minded about it. The design is a balanced policy. Hopefully, these two powers will be able to, we play a balancing role. We would rely on China for the economic opportunities, market investment, public investment for the building up of our infrastructure. But he learned something from his previous administration. You cannot simply lean on the Chinese because you still have issue when it comes to the South China Sea. So he decided to revitalize our alliance with the United States. So the approach is supposed to be balanced. But then suddenly, of course, he's confronted with the reality. The Chinese would, of course, want to engage us economically, but they will never offer any concession when it comes to the West Philippine Sea issue, South China Sea issue. China also wants to expand into our maritime domain, and of course, the purpose is to simply push out the United States Navy from operating here. Then, of course, it's only recourse to action, given the fact that China will not allow our survey vessels to conduct explorations at the reed bank. Chinese Coast Guard and Navy are, of course, still harassing our Navy and Coast Guard vessels, and to even point that the Chinese Coast Guard is even driving away ordinary fishing folks. So he was, of course, forced to revitalize our alliance with the United States. So that's the reality we face right now.
I think the first time we met, I don't know if you remember, I was asking you about a specific quote that we heard from President Marcos, which is that we don't have any territorial disputes with China, but what we have are Chinese claims on Philippine territory, something to that effect. And could you maybe refresh us on what your views are? Is that the correct approach?
Of course, that
because to a layman it sounds like a play on words, but of course to a foreign policy it seems there's a different tone to it or message to it.
This is a subtle recognition of the arbitral ruling.
Okay.
Because the arbitral ruling rejected China's 9-9 claim.
Okay.
So China has no business really entering into our maritime domain because the arbitral ruling, of course, based on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, states that China simply doesn't have any claim, legal claim. So what China is doing is simply intruding into what we considered our maritime domain.
Okay.
This is the same speech that he delivered, I think, in Cebu.
Okay.
During the exchange of command in the Western Command, when he told the Armed Forces of the Philippines, historically, our maritime borders have been secure.
Okay.
Now you have a power that is basically, challenging what has been considered as accepted, that we have this maritime domain.
Right.
And obviously, I think he's referring to China.
Right. And there's something that some people say that maybe the Philippine relations with China should not be defined by our problems in the West Philippine Sea, because there are other aspects of bilateral relations, people to people. You mentioned economic relations. Is there room for that, you think? And if there is, how do we put those non-confrontational aspects of relations at the forefront instead of these things that are, to be very frank, very worrying?
Well, that is, of course, our view as a middle power.
Okay.
That's basically our message to China. But the problem is China doesn't see it that way.
Okay.
China views it from a wider perspective.
Okay.
As a great power. And of course also view it from in terms of its objective vis-a-vis the United States.
Okay.
So for the Chinese, for us probably the issue with the West Philippine Sea is primarily economic. For the Chinese is strategic, military.
Okay. Okay.
Control, so I could prevent the United States Navy from operating here.
Okay.
So China would have to assume the role of a zero-sum player.
Okay.
The South China Sea, as of course mentioned even earlier than 2010, is part of China's core interests.
Okay.
And when China talks about core interests, Taiwan, Tibet, and the South China Sea, those issues are of course non-negotiable.
Right, right. But again, playing devil's advocate, right? So just to understand things, doesn't it work against China's own interest, maybe to see all of these tensions escalating, because it's so dialed into the global economy, right? Except maybe for the past few years, for a while, China was even known as the factory of the world. It relies on and thrives on trade with the world, and all of these things that are happening, of course, impact on the economic side of relations. As we are seeing it, there's a trade war going on between the U.S. and China. There are now maybe some signs of that, that may be going on between the Philippines and China. What do you think about that argument that to view China as hostile would be in a way incongruent because it works against their self-interest?
Well, you also have to understand how China looks at the world.
Okay.
It has a lot of things that happened, of course, ever since President Xi Jinping took over.
Okay.
So, of course, you're talking about China during the time of Deng Xiaoping.
Yeah.
Looking at reforms, looking at the possibility of being integrated into the greater market as a goal. Everything has changed, of course, with President Xi Jinping.
Okay.
His goal is basically to impress upon the world that we are a power to reckon with. We have some issues, 3 issues that we have to resolve. Number 1, the most important is Taiwan.
Right.
Second is, of course, Tibet. And the third one is, of course, the South China Sea.
Yeah.
And when it comes to this issue, they're non-negotiable. And, of course, we are very conscious of the fact that we have the 2nd largest economy in the world. We're building a navy, of course, that has become the largest in terms of quantity.
Yeah.
And, of course, the fact that China, the Communist Party, has successfully mobilized the national sentiment.
Yeah.
It had promised to the Chinese nation that we will make sure that China would remain powerful as ever, and we will not anymore suffer decline or any possibility of experiencing again the century of shame and humiliation. So we need all your support.
Yeah.
So, and this is very much reflected in the report of the 20th Party Congress last October.
Okay.
That China's view of the world has changed.
Okay.
Number one, they started talking about the stormy sea.
Yeah.
And it's time that China would have to minimize its dependence on the global market.
Okay.
And start to focus more on building up the domestic economy.
And we're seeing that now, right?
We're seeing it now. Right. China, of let's say the period of President Hu Jintao and President Xi Jinping has totally changed.
Right. Now, you know, going back to Graham Allison, why can't we have China rising in the same way as we saw maybe Japan rise in the 1980s, right? Where it didn't seem to cause or stir so much anxiety. I mean, for a while in the 80s, I remember there were people concerned about Japanese companies buying, you know, American companies and how Japanese companies would dominate the world and eclipse American corporations. But you know, I don't seem to remember a similar concern or anxiety that we seem to attach to China's rise. What do you think?
Well, number one, China is a continental power.
Okay.
It is the largest country in the region. It has this history of being the Middle Kingdom.
Okay.
Plus, of course, China is ruled by a communist party.
Okay. Yeah.
That has to basically ensure that it remains in power without any popular election. Will have to justify.
Okay.
It's, of course, its rule in terms, number one, of economic development. Now that China has achieved this economic development, the promise now to the Chinese people is, of course, China should be on the same level as the United States by 2049, and China
by 100 years,
would have to resolve all the standing issues: Tibet, Taiwan, South China Sea, and of course also impressing upon other countries. More importantly, over Japan, that I'm the power to reckon with, not that external power, which is of course the United States.
Now, I'll ask you about Philippine policy, but right now we'll just have to take another quick break. This is SMNI's Business and Politics. Please stay tuned.